Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I would like to welcome you to today's online discussion on capital market dimensions of forced labor trafficking. Thanks to all of you for your time and for joining us. My name is Iveta Vancáková, and it's a privilege for me to moderate this discussion. Just for your info, after the speech of all our panelists, we will have Q&A session. So feel free to ask your questions, and our panelists will be happy to answer. Just a short note, our guest Samuel Kogolati has to leave shortly after his intervention to plenary session in Belgian Parliament. So we are very sorry, but he would not be able to answer your questions. Now let me introduce our distinguished panelists. I would like first to introduce Roger Robinson, who is a chairman and co-founder of the Prague Security Studies Institute. Hello, Roger. Now we have our beautiful ladies, Louisa Grief, who is a director of global advocacy for the Uyghur Human Rights Project. Hello, Louisa. Then we have other beautiful lady, Robbie Saunders, who is a vice president of national security for the Coalition for Prosperous America. Hi, Robbie. And we also have a member of Chamber of Representatives of Belgium, Samuel Kogolati. Hello, Samuel.
Hello.
Last but not least, my colleague, Elias Skolt, who is a project assistant at the Prague Security Studies Institute. Hi, Elias. And me, who is Iveta Vancáková. I'm a director of Forum for Human Rights and also World Uyghur Congress policy coordinator for Visegrad countries and project coordinator at the Prague Security Studies Institute. So I will first leave the word to you, Roger, because I think you are the best to speak at the first.
Well, thank you, Iveta, and thanks to all of those joining today and taking the time to be with us. The Prague Security Studies Institute has been working on the human rights elements of authoritarian police states, notably China and Russia, since its inception over 20 years ago. So there's nothing new about that. We have also tried to pioneer the connective tissue, or nexus, if you will, between human rights abuses and the funding of those companies that have been implicated in national security and human rights abuses, who are publicly traded and who are in the portfolios, if you can believe it, of scores of millions of European and American retail investors. They're part of the major indexes or indices, like MSCI, FTSE Russell, Dow S&P. They're in the investment products of BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and other of the most notable asset managers, both in the United States and Europe. And we have found this to be a largely unrecognized dimension of the human rights abuses that we're seeing, particularly in China, which, as you know, is the leading forced labor offender of any nation on earth. So that said, we think that this particular gathering is designed to highlight two major points that we find as shortcomings in the current European legislative effort on forced labor, the ban that is initiated by the EC and is now being adjudicated in European capitals and the EU. And the US has a similar problem, even though we have already passed legislation called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. They have something in common that's a bit troubling, which is that they concentrate on products and banning the products that are made with forced labor or somehow forced labor is implicated. Products don't make themselves. These products are manufactured or harvested or whatever by companies. And we think that it's terribly important that these companies be identified publicly. And those that are publicly traded and are in the portfolios of Europeans and Americans should be denied such access. Not only are they able to raise billions of dollars in investor funds, but they enjoy the privileges and, frankly, the force multiplier of being accepted on the world's most prestigious exchanges, namely the stock and bond markets of Europe and the United States. And this represents a kind of endorsement, unwittingly, of the fact that they are legitimate players. And it's just fine to be engaged in funding entities that are, in fact, we have evidence that they're trafficking in forced labor. They are part of the surveillance state. They're aiding and abetting genocide. They're equipping concentration camps. They are building frontline weapon systems for the PLA on the national security side. There's a host of very troubling evidence, and we've worked hard along with the Coalition for a Prosperous America and others to identify these companies, demonstrate what indices they're in, what investment products they're in, and the inconsistency, which is frankly, in my view, unconscionable, of identifying a forced labor perpetrator and at the same time having them enjoy unfettered, unimpeded access to the investor financing, if you will, of, again, tens of millions, scores of millions of unwitting European and American investors. So with that short introduction, I'd like to turn it back to Iveta and onward with the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger, for your introduction, and I will leave up to Samuel. Samuel, please.
Thank you so much, Iveta, and thank you so much, dear colleagues, dear friends, for inviting me today in this very important session. I really like the focus you decided to take on this very pressing issue. I must tell you in all honesty that the last few days have been very busy for me, again, due to China. Just a few days ago, I was alerted by the Center for Cybersecurity of Belgium, my country, that I had been the target of a cyber attack by APT31. APT31, if you don't know, is a group of hackers linked to the Ministry of State Security in Beijing, working directly for the Communist Party of China. And why is that? Why is that? Of course, because I have been working for quite a long time now for Uyghur rights and for the recognition of both the Uyghur genocide and crimes against humanity happening now in Xinjiang. And that is, of course, an aspect of the fight against Uyghur forced labor. And so that's why, if you allow me, I'd like to take a few steps back and start with the beginning. When I was elected first in this house in the Parliament of Belgium, that was in 2019. I must tell you in all honesty that I didn't know much about what was happening to Uyghur people in Xinjiang, China. But just the day after my election in the parliament, I was contacted by a father, a Uyghur refugee here in Belgium, and his family, his 4 children and wife, had just been arrested within the Belgian embassy in Beijing by the Chinese police. They were actually trying to come to Belgium to get access at the Belgian embassy to, join the father who was already here in Belgium in Ghent as a refugee. And why do I talk about this story? Because by meeting this Uyghur dad, I met a lot of other Uyghur victims of what is ongoing there. And I heard all those stories about sisters, friends, fathers, cousins in the camps, about all those women victims of forced sterilization, but also about all those people victims of forced labor. And very often I'm struck to notice that for people in the street, at least in my country, China and Xinjiang seems very far away. And people may tend to, not feel too concerned about what is happening there, and tend to think that they don't really have impacts on what is happening on the ground. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And that's why I really like the focus you decided to take in this session today, because I think we do bear a responsibility to fight against imports of forced labor products. That is indeed a very effective way to address the Uyghur human rights crisis in China. And I said, we do have a responsibility. I don't know if you know, but Alibaba is a huge firm of e-commerce, decided to choose for Belgium and Liège Airport, more specifically, that's in my constituency actually, as its hub between Asia, Europe, and Africa. And so actually, Belgium now serves as a hub for e-commerce, for Alibaba, and that includes, I'm sorry to say, but that's the truth, Uyghur forced labor products. Just a few months ago, we were able to identify at least two direct flights, operating by a company that was sanctioned by the European Union, between Kashgar in Xinjiang and Liège airports. Those two flights were full of, the kinds of products that can be traced back to lines of forced labor. So I really just wanted to take the time with you to really identify the problem and say why it is so concerning also for us as Belgian people here in the heart of the European Union. Now, let me speak about two solutions. At the very least, there are more solutions, of course, and I hope you will identify today very many other political ways to address the same problem. But you all know that the European Commission has finally proposed an EU ban on products made by forced labor. Its president, Ursula von der Leyen, said that we need to add human dignity and freedom, and that, those values, those core values for the EU are more important than money. And I think that's very good and well, of course. Now, the question for me, and as you know, I'm speaking from a national parliament, not from the EU parliament, but from the national parliament at the domestic level in Belgium. The question is to know how we can actually transform that beautiful dream into legal reality. And I would say by at least two ways. In my own parliament, I have submitted a bill just a few months ago in order to recognize a new crime of importing products issued from forced labor. Of course, forced labor as such in Belgium, on Belgian territory, is forbidden and is already criminalized. Actually, forced labor is even one of the numerous aspects of crimes against humanity. The problem is you can perfectly criminalize forced labor in the Belgian territory, but if you knowingly import products from forced labor, let's say from Xinjiang, or we could also face other situations, like for example, cobalt extracted in the eastern part of the DRC, also under situation and circumstances of forced labor. If you do that from those third countries, and if you take a direct economic advantage from importing those forced labor products, actually you don't face any problem, at least in terms of legal and criminal prosecution, which I think is a problem. I think it's a problem, and we need to redress that. And again, that's how we can act, I think, positively as drivers of political but also legal change in the practice by sitting here in this parliament. We need to say very loudly, but we also need to write into the law that if you take a direct advantage from importing knowingly products from forced labor in China, well, it needs to be punished. It needs to be punished. It needs to be prosecuted by the public ministry. That's completely unfair, and that needs to change. A second way, which I would like to address with you, it's probably a bit more difficult, a bit more technical, but it's actually quite easy to do in the practice, even though it takes time. You know that, as Roger said, it is quite easy today to identify forced labor perpetrators in China. At least there have been many reports by NGOs, by civil society, that have been identifying big firms responsible for forced labor in Xinjiang. Well, what you can do is going through the reports of investments by European banks, Belgian banks, or Czech banks, and look for specific investments in forced labor perpetrators. And I think those investments should be denounced. There is what we call due diligence. Those obligations of due diligence should also apply, at least in principle, to financial institutions, which of course includes banks and insurances in our countries. And if we want to take those due diligence obligations seriously, well, that should also apply to banks, and that should also apply to forced labor perpetrators, which should be excluded from direct investments by our banks in Belgium and other European countries. So here again, those were just two very simple technical legal tools that we can apply in practice, and again, in order to terminate and to fight against forced labor. But again, I'm really looking forward to working with you in the future to continue this fight for human rights and Uyghur rights together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Samuel, also for your hard work. And I'm so sorry to hear about your cyber problem. And I really wish this attacking from the side of Chinese Communist Party will one day finish. And now I will leave the floor to you, Luisa.
Thank you so much, Iveta. Just checking that my visuals are here and visible to everyone in the webinar. Yes, thank you. Well, I'm very, very grateful to MP Kogalati for his outstanding leadership. I represent a Uyghur-led organization, the Uyghur Human Rights Project, which is a documentation and advocacy organization. And we've been documenting through at least 95 reports since 2004, so going on 20 years reporting atrocities in the Uyghur region. What's different about this ongoing genocide? And why have we been so slow to get to this point where what Roger and Samuel have been talking about is on the agenda? There are sanctions in place. I will say that the EU and the UK and Canada did do joint legacy sanctions on, let's count them, 5 perpetrators. Import bans are in place in the US, but not in Europe. We haven't talked about export bans, and where we're trying to get to is investment bans. So this is the beginning of the story. Why are we so slow? Literally in a 6th year of a genocide, why are we still having to talk about this? Well, this was a hidden genocide at the beginning. We had people disappearing. These are famous intellectuals, relatives of people of Uyghurs and Kazakhs abroad, saying, where did they go? What happened? And we had great media work covering what was going on in the Uyghur homeland in East Turkestan, Xinjiang Autonomous Uyghur Region. So you could see on the streets when journalists were allowed there that there were police stations, there were checks on the streets. You had the Wall Street Journal did an amazing job uncovering the surveillance state. These are paper forms finding with details about all the Uyghurs who were expressing their identity, seen as a threat by the state. The state sent cadres inside people's homes. They gave it a very nice name called Becoming Family. The idea was basically come in and spy on people. And then camps started opening up. And this is just a screenshot from a police social media. This was not hidden. Police did post photos of lining people up, random people. They look like prisoners, but actually they're all innocent people who've been accused of thought crime. And then we started to use the term concentration camp. This is emerging slowly, however. Now, why do I say the word concentration camp? Because you can have a giant building here that literally says Concentrated Transformation Through Education Training Center. Of course, this is all denied by the government, but satellite photos showed that when you have a giant building here, and then you can match a street level view taken by a journalist with satellite photography, you can see that giant building on the left is only a small part of a huge complex. And they were all over the country with the hallmarks of prisons. Even if they said training center on the outside, it's actually a prison here from Bitter Winter. And the size was amazing. Here you have Wall Street Journal again, looking at comparing from 1 year to the next, the incredible expansion. So I believe the world was still trying to take in what is really happening. Is it really at this incredible scale? But then we started to see where is the connection to forced labor. And it's fairly early on. I'm talking 2018. You can see the government, this is a government Global Times poster. Clearly there is labor going on. And you're starting to see, remember, December 2018, right? 5 years ago, four and some years ago, already the connection to international commerce, sportswear, traced to one of the factories in one of the concentration camps that are part of the genocide. But here we look, the Washington Post does an editorial a year later, 2019, saying evidence is emerging. You can imagine the frustration of Uyghurs saying, why does it take 1 year to discover this? And we were grateful to the Australian Policy Institute for their groundbreaking story, Uyghurs for Sale. The Washington Post did some on-the-ground research to complement ASPI's desk research and digging into company records, as Samuel said. Anna Fifield hung out for 4 days outside a Nike factory in northern China, finding Uyghurs having transported 3,000 kilometers across the country. And so you get the pressure. What is the international fashion industry doing about this? Do we know about it? Are they just continuing business as usual? A coalition was formed, the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region, which called on brands voluntarily to take action to completely end all business ties. And this was now enacted into law in the US to have not only building on a pre-existing US ban on imports of forced and prison labor goods and child labor goods. This, of course, as you all know, came into effect starting in June 2022. And we have one photograph that the Customs and Border Protection has released showing them at the ports, stopping products from the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, which is a forced labor paramilitary institution that runs prisons. Now, that's the forced labor goods. And like Samuel, I want to then turn to the surveillance question and their connections to international commerce. We're looking at incredible surveillance. Of course, there's surveillance all over China, but it was driven by the ability to collect data by force in China, where every Uyghur was taken in for mandatory health checks, for DNA testing, and in the police stations, face scans and voice scans. You can see the technology put to work with QR codes on the door so that a policeman can come by with a little handheld device, high-tech, innovation to track who belongs in this house and is anybody staying there unauthorized. And we're talking about here the New York Times showing racial profiling using face scans, and translated for us a marketing tool from one of these companies, CloudWalk, showing how they can prevent sensitive peoples, meaning Tibetans and Uyghurs, from coming anywhere. This was again reported in February 2019. Here's a PowerPoint that was recently released as part of the Xinjiang police files, which is massive trove of internal government documents where this is just a neighborhood policing station showing their superiors how they were using closed circuit TV to track and control things. And let's talk name names and talk brands. Here we have Huawei already coming out, and look at this number, $1 billion profit. So profitable companies that are, as Roger says, listed through exchanges so that international investors can try to put their hard-earned money to work, and the banks and the pension funds and the university endowments can earn a profit by investing in profitable companies. Where do they get their profits? They get $1 billion worth of profits from the genocidal government to do their work. Here's Dahua with its so-called safe city programs, a euphemism for building out the surveillance state. And here's a list of 11 companies which are now under investment ban sanctions from the US. It's far too little. We know it's a much larger number. So, and I just want to bring it home here in Europe. UHRP has done reporting about the surveillance that goes outside the country to surveil Uyghurs, to suppress free speech, to prevent them from speaking out against the genocide. And we even have Alibaba, Samuel Kogolati mentioned Alibaba. Well, we did a report already 2 years ago about one of Alibaba's subsidiaries, the Taobao auction site, auctioned the property of a slew of very successful Uyghur entrepreneurs who were put in prison, put on trial for extremist thought or being in some way a criminal offense. Their property seized and sold. Wall Street Journal did an exclusive on this and found at least $84 million in some court records online that hadn't been properly hidden by the Chinese authorities to show the complicity of Alibaba, which is New York Stock Exchange listed. So again, where are we going to get with our sanctions to respond to the genocide? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luisa. And I will just give a short remark from my side as from somebody who is a human rights, let's say, fighter. And I will maybe also follow what Samuel said, that we feel like China is very far away, and this is not something that we have to follow. But the truth is that I mean, from my perspective as somebody who was born in Czechoslovakia, I feel like it's necessary to say that a lot of European countries remember a communist regime, and forced labor was one of the tools used by communist regime to bind our freedoms and led to human rights violations. And now this is happening in China, and I think I still feel like forced labor is moral unacceptable. No child, woman, or man should suffer this serious human rights abuse. And I think it's time for Europe, and not just for US, to take action in order to protect investors, corporations, and customers over the exploitation of forced labor. Especially for us Europeans whose past is quite similar. I expect faster reactions, faster actions, and more strict position. And I believe we need to take a few steps now and immediately, because every second passes cause life damage and traumas. And although I'm glad to see the European Commission initiative effectively banning products produced, extracted, or harvested with forced labor. So now I leave the floor to my colleague Elias, who has researched this in last month.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. So my name is Elias Köld. I'm a research associate here at PSSI. I served as the lead researcher for this forced labor initiative. So I really don't need to explain to you guys that the EU is committed to combating forced labor, and that it's very vocal about its work with human rights. An example of this, for example, is in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights in Article 5, Paragraph 2, where it specifically outlines combating forced labor as a high priority. So this proposal can be sort of considered a reflection or a reflection of this commitment to these principles of combating forced labor. To just really briefly summarize the goal or the intention of the proposal, it focuses on having the competent national authorities of EU member states, so think the police or customs authorities, investigating whenever they find that a product or suspect that a product is made or tainted with forced labor. What this means is that the burden of proof lies on the national competent authorities rather than the importers, as is the case with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the US, which is a differentiation we can get into a bit more later. Just quickly regarding the legislative process, there's really no way of knowing how long time this will take. Right now, the European Commission has sent this proposal to the European Parliament and to the Council, where the co-legislators are debating this and discussing this as part of the ordinary legislative procedure. Again, there's no timeline for this, so parliamentarians are hoping that this will be done within 2023, but that's nothing more than a hope. So this can be anything from a matter of mere months to getting caught up in some legislative limbo for who knows how long. In response to this proposal, PSSI has offered direct feedback, which we uploaded directly to the European Commission. That's also available on our website if anyone's interested. And I'll distill this down to our two core points. The first one being that we believe that the proposal has to expand in its scope to cover not only these products, but also the companies behind these products. Because like Roger said, these products don't manufacture themselves. And secondly, we of course believe that capital markets needs to be addressed in this. Capital markets play an incredibly crucial role in acting as a facilitator for funding these companies and actors that exploit forced labor. So capital markets is completely unaddressed in the proposal, and that has to change. On a more sort of personal note, I want to highlight that this initiative sort of serves as, has a potential to serve as the first steps in linking human rights and capital markets. I think that these two things are intrinsically linked. Just the idea of at home on products that we use perhaps every day being created with forced labor, it not only impacts our global reputation, but also it has direct impacts on our economies. The use of forced labor undermines and violates our values of freedom and the rule of law just as much as it undermines the basic economic principles of fair competition. As forced labor robs people of their dignity, it also condemns economic communities to cycles of poverty, to inequality, and to abuse. And so just as one final sort of note to leave this on, I just want to say that one way or another, every investment that we make is an investment into our future. And with that in mind, I will leave you over to Robbie, who knows this very well.
Great. Thanks so much, Elias, and thanks everyone for all the wonderful remarks. I'm conscious of the fact that I am the last one to go, so I will try to keep it brief and short so we can move to the discussion and to the question and answer portion. I'm going to start off by briefly talking about how the U.S. is implementing our Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and a few observations that we've made from my organization with how that's going. And then I'll dovetail into what Elias was speaking of and what Roger opened with, talking about the investment ban. So first of all, in regards to how our UFLPA implementation is going, we have had some great success, as Louisa was showing, the photo of the ex-PCC goods being actively seized, inspected, and monitored by the CBP. And the U.S. Congress has given an increase in appropriations to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection for the implementation of this law, which is really important for us to see it be fully effective. And recently, I've spoken with the head of China for the U.S. CBP, and he definitely sees progress and sees some good work being done when it comes to interdiction. But maybe this is too American of me to say, but there's still a lot more work to do, and we see a few areas of needed improvement. And we're working closely with the human rights community and with Congress and with our friends at CBP, as well as at ILAB, which is the U.S. Department of Labor's Bureau of International Labor Affairs, and our friends over there, to increase, the work being done here under the auspices of the UFLPA. So a few of those areas that I just want to flag for hopeful improvement and that we're thinking about and tracking is this concept in the US regarding what is considered to be formal entry versus informal entry of goods. So there's a formal entry threshold in America of $2,500. And so what we're seeing with the UFLPA is that incoming shipments and imports coming in above $2,500 are getting due diligence, but under $2,500 are maybe not. And that's something that we think is maybe a bandwidth issue, is a staffing issue, a capacity issue, but we're seeking to solve that. Furthermore, our de minimis threshold is $800. And so goods can enter the US without any inspection and duty-free if the shipment is $800 or lower. And I know for the European Union, I believe that threshold is 150 euros. So our threshold is about 754 euros if you converted that in America. And so we're seeing a lot of potential forced labor goods slipping in under that category. Things like Alibaba type products or women's fashion from Shein, things that are coming in that are cheaply made, oftentimes in small batch, shipments that are not being tracked. And then lastly, I'll say too, we would love to see more transparency in terms of importers having to provide their bills of lading. And so Louisa knows our long-held concerns about how this works, but within the U.S. government, if you come in, your goods are coming in on an airplane, you do not have to provide the same type of records and make publicly available your import information than if you did if your goods were coming in on a cargo ship, for example. And then even more so, you could request that your records not be made public, and the government can then seal your information so that NGOs and civil society or competitor companies cannot police you. And that's something that, to Samuel's point earlier too, regarding this new e-commerce hub for Alibaba in Belgium and the flights that they had observed, coming in, that's hard to do in the US just because of, again, the lack of transparency on bills of lading. And then, of course, we'd love to see, more lab testing. We find that these shipments that come in under the formal threshold or that are under the de minimis threshold or come in by, air cargo as opposed to a ship or other freight form, their lab testing is not widely available. And we'd love to see more of that. Beyond just how UFLPA is going, shifting over to divestment, we are so excited about the future work that we can do in this space and to build off of exactly what everyone has been thinking about. It's stopping the goods is important, and forced labor goods have been illegal in the United States since the 1930s. So this is something we've been tracking for a long time, and we're so grateful that the UFLPA created this new mechanism with the rebuttable presumption, which I know Elias was really clear to distinguish is different than the proposal right now in the EU. But I think that what's really key here is that we're looking at how we can take that rebuttable presumption and then expand further to the actual folks behind those goods and how we can look at divestment. And so for us, we think that the UFLPA entity list is nice, but what it does is it names companies that are outside of Xinjiang, because everything in Xinjiang is presumed to have been made with forced labor. So anything that's Xinjiang produced or labor transfer produced has this rebuttable presumption applied to it. But there's this additional list that they created and that the US government is tracking of companies that they believe also should rise to the same threshold of presuming forced labor. But that list is really small. And so we want to, by tracking these companies, by labeling their financiers, by labeling the ways that the US is funding them and Western investors are funding them, be able to bring more offenders into the light. And I know I'm running out of time, Iveta, so feel free to intervene here and stop me. But that is our main objective, is how can we get these guys labeled, get them out there, and to know where you can make choices and changes in your own investment behavior so that you're not funding Alibaba or Hikvision or Tencent or these other guys. And I will say that Coalition for a Prosperous America very soon will be working to release a product that outlines about 66 or so of these companies. And so we can know exactly where some of these guys are, who is investing in them, and how you can change your own behavior such that your exchange traded funds, your mutual funds, where you're putting your money is not supporting these forced labor and surveillance, state offenders. So with that, back over to you, Iveta.
Thank you very much, Robbie, and thank you also for telling us about the 66 companies. I think this is could be also very interesting for us to know, and also very important job. Now I'm opening the Q&A session, and we have some questions here. So let me read the first questions. Banks often take a pretty approach to compliance with regulation. That is, they are actively comparing the expected returns to expected consequences. Further, several countries, UK or Australia, have introduced legislation nominally against forced labor in supply chains. But there is little evidence that those are moving companies to action. What specific consequences do you suggest to investing in firms known to use forced labor that would be an effective deterrent? So please, if any, yes, Roger, please.
Yes, there are a number of ways that this could be accomplished, but just let me give you a thought or two on that. In the U.S., with Executive Order 13959 under President Trump and Executive Order 14032 under President Biden, these executive orders provided, in effect, that companies, Chinese publicly traded companies that were doing business with military Chinese companies, that is, supporting the military industrial complex of China, would be barred, that is, U.S. citizens would be barred from holding the securities, read the stocks and bonds, of those companies. It would become illegal to do so. In the Biden administration, it would become incumbent on folks that were holding such companies to not be able to buy and sell those stocks, for example, thereby making them non-viable. So I would say that that is a model, a precedent for what we could see on forced labor abusers with respect to their presence on European and US exchanges. The most effective way possible would be to basically deny or make illegal the holding of those securities in forced labor perpetrating companies. That would be by far the most effective. You could also delist or deregister such companies, deregistering being a stronger measure than delisting, from such exchanges. That would certainly get China's attention. We have to recognize that these are capital market sanctions that China genuinely fears. This is not the slap on the wrist that we're used to seeing, whereby you're not modifying corporate behavior, really, even in the US and Europe, because the penalties are not compelling enough. And capital markets, when you're talking about the money, all of a sudden that equation changes very radically. So that's why we feel so strongly that capital market sanctions are arguably the most powerful source of leverage, the most powerful persuasive tool that we have in our non-military arsenal to attack and defend human rights abuse, against human rights abuses of this kind. So that's why we feel so strongly that this new set of tools are made available to both sides of the Atlantic and are used effectively to put real fear on the part of those in China, as well as the US, Wall Street players and their equivalents in Europe, who are seeing large fees, who feel that they want to continue to make those fees. And if it gets in the human rights is a distant second concern. It's almost like it's somebody else's job. There's no due diligence taking place per se on national security and human rights concerns today. No, you don't see, it's very rare that you see fund managers, asset managers, index providers that are voluntarily divesting these stocks, even though their corporate reputations and brands could be put at risk. And we very much want those corporate reputations and brands put at risk. And you start to play in that league, and I'll tell you, it will turn around what the questioner is legitimately concerned about, which is nobody seems to be reacting. Well, we think that this gathering that we're having right now is the beginning of changing that risk calculus fundamentally. Thank you.
And Iveta, if we have a moment, I'd like to just add on briefly to what Roger shared.
Yeah, please.
In addition to what Roger's mentioned about the executive actions taken by the US government, the Congress is actually looking to pass a law to further codify and strengthen these capital markets bans and expand them. And so there's been a couple hearings held in Congress. And I think there's a realization that a lot of the supply chain due diligence isn't quite working, or there's a lot of, box check activity happening of companies submitting, PDF forms to say that they're complying, but then there's a lack of true follow through. And so to Roger's point, we believe firmly the capital market sanctions component, the forced, divestment or prohibitions on trading is the key. And the US government's looking to go beyond some of this, the surveillance technology companies or the military companies, but to other human rights abusers as well.
I really think it's an excellent question. I want to bring up another tool, which is an excise tax on institutions that hold these complicit companies in their portfolios. So for example, you take a university endowment, public or private, many of them have endowments, which they invest in the markets, and they have special tax privileges, right? They're nonprofit institutions. They're not paying taxes on their earnings like anyone else. And so one option is to say, well, there will be a tax. And in fact, there are some members of the US Congress that want to tax an excise tax on the entire amount of the profit that they would get from funding the activities and expanding the market power of those companies that are selling their surveillance systems to the Xinjiang government, for example, in order to carry out a genocide. So an excise tax is actually a tax rather than a ban, which should provide real leverage to make these fund managers think twice.
Thank you, all of you. I just want to add that if anyone else have any other questions, please feel free to write. And I would like to ask you, panelists, just a bit shorter answer, so we can I think go on more questions. So now I have a question on Luisa. Thinking beyond just Europe and the US, if we were to move forward with capital markets and investment ban on forced labor abusers, what would that mean for the Uyghur population in China, who have been victims of the CCP tolerance of and even encouragement of forced labor practices?
Thank you for that question, Iveta. And again, I haven't said thank you to you for all you're doing over these last several years to really try to wake up Europeans along with people around the world to say there is something we can do, as Roger and Samuel both said. I think for Uyghurs, since I work for a Uyghur-led organization, I can say that inaction is a green light for genocide. And again, I emphasized this sort of 2018, 2019, when the information is known, a lot of people feel European values, America's support for human rights and defending democracy around the world should mean action. And when you see pinprick actions around the world, Uyghurs are really wondering, is the world happy with an ongoing genocide? Just business as usual, our profits are more important. Wall Street has a bigger voice than people whose own relatives are being tortured. So this frustration for Uyghurs to really weeping for their family, their homeland, being in exile, it really actually makes them wonder where the commitment is. So that's part of the emotional reaction, if that's what you're asking me to convey. Thank you so much, Iveta.
Thank you, Luisa. And now I will leave the word to Elias.
Yeah, I think we have a question here for Robbie, although I do believe that Roger, you may be able to add to this as well. The question being, what direction do you see Washington, D.C. heading in regarding forced labor legislation in the near future? And is this considered a bipartisan issue in the U.S.? Or will the direction Washington takes be heavily influenced by whether a Democrat or Republican controls the executive office or the House or the Senate?
I'll jump in and start off the answer and then turn it over to Roger to fill in what I missed. So this is a really bipartisan issue for us. We have seen great success, with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act being led by Representative McGovern, by Senator Rubio. We've had such engagement from the leaders of several different U.S. entities that are Congressional Executive, Commission on China, with the new China Select Committee that was created in the U.S. House of Representatives, and these bodies that are bipartisan, and they continue to do this great work. So Representative Mike Gallagher and then Representative Christian Morphy, a Republican and a Democrat, are co-leading this new China Select Committee in Washington that held their first hearing this week on Tuesday evening. And actually in their hearing, they talked about divestment and went through the U.S. sanctions apparatus and our gaps in our sanctions policy. And when I talk about sanctions, I'm talking about, capital market sanctions, about our export controls, and about how we can do more there. And so there's a lot of really great bipartisan interest. And actually, Roger got a shout out in that hearing on Tuesday night, which was great. So I do see that there's going to be some future work, both with this legislation moving in terms of sort of codification of capital market sanctions, as well as expanding our standards on human rights violations and how we can more closely, link the capital markets piece to the human rights element. And I do think too that regardless of a Republican or Democrat, being in charge of either Chamber of Commerce or Congress or the White House, that there is interest and there will be committed action. I think it just takes a little bit different angle and a little bit different flavor, but there's a lot of bills moving bipartisanly, and there's actually interesting confluence of partisan needs on both sides of what angles, what arguments, and what do they care about more that pulls on, their policy heartstrings to take action. But I think there is definitely a committed bipartisan effort there. And I do think you'll see something sometime this year, maybe, on further supporting the UFLPA from our government, whether it's expanded authorities or more appropriations or something. I think that there's a lot of momentum behind continued successful implementation there.
And I would just add that Robbie's got a much better handle on Capitol Hill's mood because she's taking the pulse every single day. I would merely say that this is one of the really rare instances of bipartisan foreign policy, national security policy, in the history of this country, in the U.S. side. It's a matter of education of the type that we're trying to advance with gatherings like this. For example, you can be sure that the Congress, if they understood that it's trillions of dollars, not hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars over these past several years have moved from American retail investors and their retirement and other investment accounts into the coffers of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, that's not some wild claim. That's a fact, an empirical, provable fact. Just like what we're saying in terms of forced labor companies littering the portfolios of major asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard. That is a fact. They are also in all the major indices, MSCI again, FTSE Russell, Dow S&P. So you can't argue with the empirical evidence. And it's amazing that the due diligence and the risk that these asset managers and index providers are running by themselves trafficking, in effect, in these companies hasn't been adequately recognized. So I think with the new mood in the Congress and frankly, some of the activities of the Republican now controlled House, such as the China Select Committee, there's going to be a much deeper dive. And when that happens, these are the kinds of revelations that they're going to see. There are 35 or so Chinese companies in the federal thrift retirement system. That's the pension system of the American government. All of our military are holding Chinese CCP companies that are implicated in weapons manufacturing, designed to, of course, to be used against them in a future conflict. So, in other words, the abuses are multifaceted, forced labor being one very troubling category, but there are others, and in the human rights area as well. So the point is that I think that you're going to see the aperture expand considerably now. And when that happens, there's a recognition that Wall Street and other Wall Street equivalents in Europe have, frankly, quite a cynical attitude toward all this. They're so recalcitrant, it's so greed-driven, frankly, that you're going to have to make it illegal, because they have already stated that if it's legal, they don't give a damn. They're going to proceed until it's illegal. Well, okay, if that's the way you want to be, we'll arrange for it to become illegal. And that's why there's going to be a very concentrated effort to take advantage of this new bipartisan political feeling on Capitol Hill and elsewhere, and in the 50 states, and in the university endowments, as Louise has pointed out. I mean, this is a widespread abuse, and the states should care, and in many cases already have taken action to put their pension system administrators on the hot seat to say, how in good conscience can you be having the public employees of Tennessee or West Virginia or wherever it may be, Florida, that are investing in these companies? So it's not just a federal thing, although the federal level is the best from the point of view of law passing, that's for sure. But nevertheless, that's the scale. And just a final note on that, when you talk about leverage, the US capital markets, for example, are roughly the size of the rest of the world's combined. The US has 66% of the world's investable capital and liquidity. Now just think about those numbers for a minute. In other words, you can say, well, the Chinese companies will simply go elsewhere to raise their money. That's kind of a joke. Where? London, Frankfurt, Milan? I mean, there's no liquidity, insufficient liquidity and depth to go elsewhere. I mean, the US has a dominant position in the global financial domain. That's just a fact. And combined with our European friends and Japanese who care about this issue deeply, I know that for a fact, we have all the makings of a global effort here to employ, finally, our greatest source of leverage, which is the money. I'll say again. And I think the breakthrough is going to come.
And one other point really quickly to add to what Roger said is disclosures are really important to us and something that we see possible action on as well, because there's such a lack of transparency right now with these companies and how they're playing the games in the market. And so as we're building toward, the illegal action and making these things impossible to do, we also are increasing information, transparency, and empowering the individual investors and those that are working with the state pension funds or the university endowments to say, you have the knowledge now, these companies are bad. We're requiring information about, beneficial ownership or linkages to CCP, state-owned enterprises, et cetera, to come to the forefront, which then means that it makes it basically impossible then for the investment behavior to continue. And so that's one avenue that we see a lot of bipartisan interest in as well, is how can we increase transparency, disclosures, and oversight to then force the divestment and then force the money from stopping flowing.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Robbie. And Louisa, I have a question to you. How successful are we in punishing Western companies making use of products originating from forced labor?
Thanks, Iveta, and thank you to the participant who raised the question. Yes, human rights groups, Uyghurs, the Uyghur Human Rights Project, are very impatient for punishment. We have seen some reporting coming from our Customs Department, Customs and Border Protection Commission, to the tune of about, by some counts, almost $1 billion worth of goods at least detained for inspection. Unfortunately, we don't know that much about how many were seized and destroyed, how many were simply turned around and the importer was able to say, well, if you are going to ask me to prove that my supply chain is free of Uyghur forced labor, then never mind, I'm going to have to re-export. We don't know how much of that is happening. So all of our coalition, the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region, all the human rights groups are saying, we have to have that transparency of data, even know about the enforcement. Congress needs to know if they've made this commitment. So that is a commitment that CBP has made to make more information available. So the answer is we don't really know, but we do know one thing. There have been no announced fines or penalties. The most that might have happened is that a company has its shipment slowed, so that interrupts their profit, right? They are operating on their margins. If your things are seized, you have to go through a back and forth to try to prove that your goods are not made with forced labor. Yes, that can be a cost to business and should be a deterrent. And yet we know there are these seizures all the way through. This law has been known since December last year. It's already a year, more than a year, and still things are being detained. So it does go to that question that Roger is raising, like what is going on in the minds of the companies when they somehow think that this won't affect them. But obviously it would be very salutary to have some real fines and penalties or criminal prosecutions, as Samuel mentioned, for knowingly importing these goods. So it's a story that has yet to be told.
Great, thank you. This is a bit of an open question. I want to say we have approximately, I'd say, around 5 more minutes of Q&A time, so perhaps a bit of a briefer answer. And this is just an open question. The Corporate Accountability Lab has introduced evidence that US prison labor is a high risk for forced labor. Further, the ILO made reference in their 2022 prevalence report to the danger that, given the evidence of racialized differences in sentencing, that the US is in danger of state-imposed forced labor within its prison systems. So the question is as follows. What can the EU do through mechanisms like proposed import bans and proposed investment bans like this one to increase transparency and protect the rights of US prisoners?
I personally don't have an observation on that, only because that requires, in effect, a separate background study. And I'm afraid, from my point of view, at least, it's outside of the scope a little bit of the proceedings today. I've no doubt that it's a legitimate question, but I'm not sure that U.S. forced labor fits quite properly in this context, would be my observation. But I thank the questioner anyway.
Right, I think we can run with one final question. Of the policy ideas and proposals being discussed, which ones do the panelists think are most likely to advance in this session of the US Congress?
Robbie, maybe?
Great, sure. So we know that codifying the investment ban and the capital market sanction policy, as Roger noted, with these previous executive orders of both the Trump and Biden administrations, is underway. And so we very much so hope that this bill gets, moved to the House floor and should actually fairly easily pass in the Senate. And so what it does is strengthens the penalties of companies that are listed on our non-SDN Chinese military industrial complex companies list, which includes some of the surveillance tech companies as well as those military civil fusion companies. And so it would ratchet up those punishments as well as then expand the scope of who gets on it by taking another list from the US government over. So I think for my perspective, that bill, which has already been part of a hearing in February in the House Committee on Financial Services, stands the greatest chance of advancing. But we have a whole slew of efforts, including some work in the pension fund department, divesting the federal pension system from Chinese companies. It's over $730 billion. We have several irons in the fire overall in terms of loopholes and gap closing. But for me, I think it's that codification of our cap market sanctions regime as well as something in regards to the UFLPA kind of 2.0, which we hope comes to be. But I'll turn it over to Louisa.
I would also add that it does look, as Robbie mentioned, that there will be more sanction authorities that Congress is going to look to, literally with taking the genocide as a focus and looking where more sanctions can come in, because there are more privileges of travel, right? Not every perpetrator is named on a visa ban, and corporate and perpetrator accountability are absolutely on the agenda, and there is a bipartisan support for that. We haven't seen a bill yet. So there are a large choice, we have a good choice, and we do expect that with the revelations, the whole purpose of this Health Select Committee, as stated by the bipartisan leadership, chair and ranking member, is to enable the American voters to see what the threats are. And then we do expect that action will come more quickly, perhaps, than in the past.
And my only thought to the question would be that it's useful to think of the cap market issue as having three pillars: human rights, national security, and investor protection. There's not one Chinese company of the over 5,000 traded in the United States that is compliant today with US federal securities laws. As we may know, those Chinese companies are black boxes. They don't reveal their finances. They're not audited by US government entity as called for by the law. The point is that the investor protection, the complete, again, black box non-transparency and investor protection angle is a very important one. And I think that it is a way forward legislatively to basically say that China's not abiding by the rules that every other player in the market's abiding by, and that's simply not on. So it's very useful to keep in mind these three pillars of, again, human rights, national security, and investor protection. We talk about another legislative vehicle would be sanctions harmonization. You're on a sanctions list of the Commerce Department called the Entity List, the blacklist. You're presumably not allowed to get a license for American equipment and technology because you're an egregious national security or human rights abuser corporately. But at the same time, you can continue to raise money and trade to your great advantage on the US capital markets and even the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ with impunity. I mean, that's the kind of thing that we're trying to, glaring inconsistency that we're trying to remedy here by saying, look, if you can't, if you're out of US equipment and technology, you darn well should be out of the US capital markets as well. So that's another one that has a very good chance. And we could go through a list here, but I do believe that that Robbie's right, that it's going to be a very active year in this category because, as I said, there are a troubling number of avenues whereby China is not playing by the global rules and is profiting handsomely despite the continuation of these heinous practices. And that's what we're all about going after. And I thank you again for all of your attention today.
Thank you very much. I'm opening last 1 minute of if you have any final thoughts or remarks. Very shortly.
I'll just briefly say I'm very grateful for this opportunity to join all of you today, and we look forward to seeing the final product and actions coming out of the EU, and are grateful that others are taking steps here to try and combat these atrocities, and grateful for my co-panelists today. I found Louisa's presentation to be so thorough in terms of documenting, why we're here and why we care about this. And I would just add that we will be sharing, our list of forced labor and surveillance state companies with all of you soon. We're just putting a few polishing touches on how we're presenting it and some data visualization kind of graphics that we thought would be helpful coming up at the last minute, but we believe it's truly the next step to building on the successes of the UFLPA thus far, is to stop the financing of these goods and of these companies that are complicit in producing them. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Sorry. And I just wanted to add that if anyone is interested in this topic, we are also organizing one event in April in Prague. So stay tuned and just please follow our website of Prague Security Studies Institute or also our social accounts of all the panelists. And yeah, Louisa, please.
I want to give a big shout out to a very broad coalition of groups who work on modern slavery, trafficking, human rights more broadly, including the trade union sector. So for a lot of people who might say, you know, it's really a partisan thing, whether or ideological, whether in Europe or the US, to be anti-China. Well, let's say that global movements like the global trade union movement, the UFLPA, and the ITUC at the international level, it's the trade unions that are bringing state-sponsored forced labor to the ILO, where China has a seat, and business has a seat, and labor has a seat. So there is quite a broad coalition, and we're frustrated at lack of progress, but we're not frustrated at the growing number of allies who are ready to push back on Wall Street and the corporate complicity. Thanks.
Okay, if no any other remarks, then I will close the discussion of today. I would like to thanks to our great panelists for this interesting and very important topic. And thank you also all of you for your time and joining us. Thanks also for all the organizations who were organizing this event, especially Prague Security Studies Institute, Uyghur Human Rights Project, Forum for Human Rights, and Coalition for Prosperous America. Thank you all of you for joining.